Welcome, NutritionRadio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Lecture time. Hey, everybody. We've got some lecture time for you today. What I have done is taken the liberty of really condensing and sort of jumping to the end like the TLDR, kind of too long, didn't read sort of version of this lecture. The lecture was over an hour long, but we're going to cut just to the summary. So let me set this up for you. There's a couple of things that we talk about when it comes to breaking out of or understanding body composition plateaus, like when you get stuck, whether it's fat loss or muscle gain. So this lecture started off talking about how everything is biopsychosocial, right? We can't just look at the biology. That's my bias. But my wife is a licensed counselor, so she leans into the behavioral side of things, right? That kind of thing. So there's a lot of biopsychosocial things that affect weight management. On a biological side, age, sex, training status, right? Injuries, which can increase the stress response and raise resting metabolic rate. But if your lower body is hurt, for example, it's really hard to expend a lot of calories on the calorie output side because you really can't move around a lot. Your gym options are limited. Your team practices are severely limited. Obviously, genetics, right? Nutrigenetics, your microbiome. There's a ton of things that go into personalized nutrition. On the psychosocial, and if I lump those two things together, this could be something like socioeconomic status. Like, do you have the money for a gym membership? Is your neighborhood safe enough to go for those, early morning brisk walks? Or are there parks so you can do hikes? Are there sidewalks, right? You live on a farm, it's all mud sometimes. What are you going to do? There are things like your habits, long-entrenched habits that might be difficult to overcome. It might be something like an enabler, somebody who comes around and really sabotages your diet, the strictness of it, or that could even be a loved one, a family member, right? But biopsychosocial is a big deal. At this point in the course, we had already talked about body composition, right? Everything that goes into that number on the scale. But we're also recently talking here about the thermodynamics, if you will, of the energy in, energy out, the energy balance. So if calories come in through proteins, carbs, and fats, and alcohol, and they go out through basal metabolic rate, that's the biggie, thermic effect of food, and protein is really the king there, and the thermic effect of activity, you've got this sort of bucket, if you will, where you're pouring in calories at the top through the foods that you eat, and then there's these holes in the bucket, dear Liza, and the big one is BMR, but there's also TEF, thermic effect of food, and the TEA, the thermic effect of activity. So you have to think about what's coming and going. You have to think about general exercise principles here, like diminishing returns, right? A classic exercise principle is that the closer you are to your genetic ceiling, the less progress quantitatively you're going to make. In other words, you have to be satisfied with smaller, maybe just a few percent gain. If you're an advanced athlete, and many of you are intermediates or advanced, you know that you're not going to just put on 20 pounds of muscle this training cycle, most likely. So as we head into this brief summary, I am talking about the energy balance. We had even calculated with either like a Harris-Benedict equation or a Mifflin-St. Jeor. There's these different regression equations, so you can ballpark your calorie needs. You can even just do this with 1 kcal per kg, per hour each day to get you your resting metabolic rate. Then you figure how many 100 calories for your gym workouts, maybe adding in some for that hypermetabolism of DOMS, right? Delayed onset muscle soreness. That's going to waste 100 or 200, perhaps more calories. Injuries and stress factors. There's a lot of things that go into this estimating your calorie needs. We talk about percent macros, so not just calories, but where are they coming from and how they're timed. Those are, in fact, factors. And at this point in the course, we had also been talking about practical stuff, like if you're on a team sport, like let's say you're a football lineman, the coach wants you to actually lose some weight, lose some body fat. You don't want to go overtrain yourself by going on endless runs outside of team practices, for goodness sake. So there's some practical stuff that I touch on here at the end. And I harp on training and diet logs. for most athletes, this is really important, so you can go take a look at your training log. What are the training loads like? What's your diet like? Because what you may think, just memory-wise, it might not be perfectly accurate. So that's a lot of setup here, but let's go on to this, again, very end summary of this breaking plateaus when it comes to fat loss and muscle gain. So as we end this presentation here, a summary on breaking plateaus. Gains or losses may come more slowly because someone is intermediate or advanced. We just need to keep that in mind. Maybe they're not stuck on a plateau. They're just closer to their genetic potential for leanness, let's say. Second bullet, pay attention to common mistakes that athletes overlook. They don't keep training logs. A lot of people just stop eating in general. They don't look at the protein, carb, and fat ratio and how they can tweak that. Those sorts of things. Third bullet, calculate energy balance. That is intake versus output. So you can estimate realistic daily goals. And like I said before, once we know calorie needs, then we can set the macronutrient proportions, like 20% protein, 50% carbohydrate, 30% fat. And those percentages can change based on the person. And again, we start with the sort of either a calorie per kg per hour or the Harris-Benedict equation, that kind of thing. Remember, we practiced a calculation on an earlier slide. Lastly, muscle gain. Encourage calorie surplus in order to overcome a higher metabolic rate from overfeeding. Your metabolism does speed up with overfeeding, just like it slows down when you fast. Also, you may have a higher metabolism from muscle soreness or recent muscle growth. Remember, muscle is energy costly. So encourage that calorie surplus, healthy fats, liquid calories, that kind of thing. Keep a training log, again. Time nutrients around workouts, very helpful for muscle gain. On the fat loss side, use caution not to overtrain an overfat athlete outside of practices. Like I said, if all they're doing is high-intensity interval work to lose fat, although that can be effective, that could overtrain them and burn them out if they're doing that on top of 2 hours a day with their team. So something to consider. I'm actually a fan of the direct fat oxidation approach. But again, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So just like with the muscle gain, have an athlete occasionally keep a food log for 3 days that you can analyze, at the very least for 1 day that you can sort of scan over visually, looking for fruits and veg and whatnot, and keep a training log so we can quantify how many calories are coming and going, what macronutrients are coming and going, that sort of thing. And then don't cut per os intake. Per os just means by mouth, too dramatically. If you do, you're going to crush their metabolic rate. Okay, so that's it. That's about an hour's worth of discussion on fat loss and muscle gain. I would take a break for a while before you come back to the eating disorders presentation. It is more brief. So maybe that was too brief, but you get the idea. I think there's a big summary of things. We need to think like a scientist, and a lot of the student athletes that I teach don't. It's really hard to control what you don't measure. So we need to quantify things on both the intake side, calories first, and then computing what percentage of each macro would go into that for an individual. But then on the calorie output side, all the things that can come into play. And it does get more nuanced than you might think with injury and muscle soreness and all that kind of stuff that can play into that. So we have to think like a scientist in order to manage, right, a mesocycle, to periodize the nutrition with the training and manage a mesocycle, which is might be a 12 or 16 or 20 week section of training toward the macro cycle, right? The end game, which could be anywhere from a year, which is common, to sometimes a couple of years, let's say if you're an Olympic athlete. So thinking like a scientist is my usual mantra with these students. Anyway, I hope that was enlightening. Again, another little peek into the classroom, in this case, for breaking fat loss and muscle gain plateaus. We'll see you next time. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.